As a non-funded group, we've requested and received funds to pay for publicity and hire of the hall this evening from a local council, Ineos and Kevin Hollingrake. And we're very grateful for this because it means that we've not had to charge you for tickets. Their contributions have not influenced the agenda, and if anyone else would like to contribute financially, please have a word with me afterwards. Thank you also to Ian Harper and Colin Merritt, who have put in a lot of time and thought to this evening. The chair and panel members have kindly given their time, which we also greatly appreciate. We have a very experienced team tonight, who will be chaired by Helen Robinson from Helmsley. She's a barrister. She will introduce herself and the members of the panel in a moment. So, over to you, Helen.
Okay, first of all, welcome everyone. There are other things we can all do with our Saturday evening. My husband has gone to see Billy Budd at Opera North, which is perhaps why I'm here, instead of joining him. You could be at home watching Strictly, but instead you're here to hear information given. This isn't a meeting at which you're necessarily going to change anyone's minds. But one of the things that I think is important in all the debate around fracking is that people are as well informed as possible. I came across in the course of my preparation for this meeting a survey which has been publicised in the last couple of days from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy of 2,080 households which were questioned. A third opposed fracking, 17% supported it, and 48% had no opinion. Now, that is really quite significant, I think. And so to start the evening, I'd just like to see where this audience falls in broad terms. Who, if you would show, please, by a show of hands, if you support fracking, firstly. Secondly, if you oppose it. And thirdly, if you have no opinion.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so perhaps a little more slanted than that survey reveals, but nevertheless, an important number of people here this evening don't have an opinion and are here to obtain information, perhaps to help them. So if you have a strong view one way or another, and you hear a view or a position advanced that you don't agree with, please don't start barracking the speaker. Please don't interrupt the meeting. I may well allow supplemental questions on a point, but this is a civilised evening, and I hope it won't descend into something more like a protest evening if you hear something you don't like. So having said that, I'd just like, rather than me introduce each of the speakers, I think in a couple of lines, and it partly helps us understand whether or not everyone can hear them, if we could just move along the row, please, and everyone say in just a couple of sentences who they are and why they're here. Thank you.
Yes, good evening. My name's Robert Arnott. I've been involved in the energy industry, either on the banking or in the industrial side, or as a lecturer and observer of energy for the last 30 years or so. So I'm here tonight really to put across my views and answer any questions just on my observations of what I've seen in the energy industry in the last 30 years.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jo Hawkins. I'm a lecturer at the University of Leeds, so I lecture in law, and I've been looking at issues in relation to the regulatory framework around fracking since about 2012. So I'm here today to try and answer some of the questions about the legal sides and the legal issues relating to fracking, whether it be regulation or some of the planning issues as well.
Kevin Hollingrake, I'm the local Member of Parliament.
Thank you. Yes.
Tom Pickering, thank you very much for the invitation this evening. I'm Operations Director for Ineos Shale.
My name is Lindsay Burr and I am a Rydale District Councillor for Malton, and 3 years ago I was elected as a County Councillor for Malton Division, which incorporates a village called Kirby Misperton, where a licence has been granted. So I have no PhD in anything to do with fracking. I'm just coming here today to give you my personal opinion and what residents have been telling me.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Chris France. I'm the Director of Planning at the North York Moors National Park. I've been in that role for the past 6 years, and prior to that I had planning jobs with 2 other national parks, so really my professional experience in planning has been very much to do with nationally protected landscapes. I'm not a minerals planner, but the last 4 years I've been spent working on a joint minerals local plan that covers this area with the North Yorkshire County Council and the City of York, and that is an incredibly important document that you should look out for because it's out for consultation early next month.
Okay, thank you everyone. So the structure of this evening will be in the main to respond to questions which have been submitted in advance, covering a wide range of topics. The topics are under 5 headings. The first is what is fracking, then looking at the impact on our region. Thirdly, more general questions on why do we need fracking. Fourthly, questions dealing with local views and the consultation process. And then lastly, issues surrounding regulation, law, control and monitoring. Now, the evening is billed as lasting for 3 hours. I think everyone will well and truly run out of steam after about 2. So I intend to ask a couple of panellists in relation to each question that's been submitted, and if it's appropriate, we'll have a section for supplemental questions at the end. But hopefully many of the questions that you might have come here to ask yourselves have been thought of by someone else, because I have quite a substantial wodge of them here. Because of the difficulties in running up and down stairs, I'm not necessarily going to ask everyone who's submitted a question to ask their own question. Particularly the longer ones I may well read out just to see how things are going time-wise. If anyone does need to leave to use the facilities, just do so with a minimum fuss, and we'll see how the evening goes. So the first question is one submitted by Ian Harper, which is in relation to what is fracking and what does it involve. And it deals really with how many wells there are. So the question is this: there is a huge variation in claims about how many shale gas wells can be expected within a single 10 kilometre by 10 kilometre square, from a few up to around 400. What do the panellists believe, and what do they believe is acceptable? First of all, Tom Pickering from INEOS, perhaps you could give us an idea in a single 10 kilometre square well area, what is realistic in this area?
The answer to that is that in a 10 by 10 area, we expect, given what we know about the geology in the area, that you would, firstly, you'd screen, so there are areas that you simply can't go to because there's urbanisation, there's environmental designations, so you'd take away from that surface what is accessible. So we'd expect that you'd have around 10 sites within a 10 by 10 area, each with about 10 well bores on that site.
Right, so about 10 with about 10 on that site. Yep. And when you're referring to those figures, are you referring to the specific area we're talking about here, based around Easingwold?
Yes, I am, and if you go to our website, you'll find that that's what's stated on our website. We made an error which we apologised for. I think that's probably where that question has come from, but it continues to be, despite us having made a clear statement of the error, exactly how it occurred, and explained how the number is constructed when set out to those in Rydale that asked. And that continues to be floated, and I continue to be asked, and I continue to explain in the same way, and that is the answer, and you'll find it on our public website.
Okay. Rob, do you have anything to contribute in terms of this particular area?
Well, I mean, I think I agree in terms of you will only drill those wells where you think that the geology underneath is prospective enough to actually have the fracturing. But if you to frack a well, but I mean, some of the initial literature that was put out by INEOS was suggesting 396 wells from 12 to 14 sites per well, as in some of the literature which I've got here. So I'm not entirely clear. And then this is the sort of density of wells that you would get in the areas in North America, but of course we're a very different environment to that. But I would suggest that it really depends on the prospectivity subsurface, and any company that was looking to exploit the subsurface to maximum effect would drill as maximum number of wells it could to get the maximum amount of cash flow.
Yeah. So I think what Rob's saying, Tom, is that there really is more potential in this area. What is the position with regard to the geology and the aspiration of INEOS?
So let me just cover that point again, because what hasn't been acknowledged there is the environmental designations that sit on the surface, the urbanisation and villages that sit on surface that have to be deducted from that picture. Now, Rob's quite correct. If you find in this early phase of testing the geology and understanding whether it can flow, a key consideration is whether or not you can economically develop something that is of scale and valuable to produce. And that is tied in with the geology. If we see that the geology is simply not as we might imagine it to be now, and actually the surface constraint to accessing and producing that is too great, it would be one of the components of shale gas development that might mean that you simply can't develop it because the restriction in access at surface does not allow access to the resource. And the planning colleagues will speak to that. You know, there are designations. We have a development planning and development system which guides those development proposals, and it takes into account all of the features that I'm describing when considering consenting or not any development, including shale.
So in terms of if I can just ask you again on this point, what is the aspiration for INEOS in this particular locality? Because I think that's what the question's aimed at, is how many wells are actually hoped for.
So at the moment, Ike, the answer is what I've set out to you is within that 10 by 10 block, what I know of the geology at the moment. But I think the question you're asking me is, what are we doing, or what will we seek to do to explore and understand this resource? Because the media would have you believe that you're moving to multiple sites tomorrow. And the reality is that you have to work through quite a systematic process of science. 2D seismic, 3D seismic, core drilling to sample the geology and to understand whether there's oil and gas present, in what quantity. And from that then, that technical and commercial picture, the ability to frame whether or not environmentally you're going to conduct and test a flowed well. And that, so in this area we have a well commitment. I think I'm right in saying in Yorkshire it's a six well commitment that we gave to government. When you bid these licences to government, you bid because it's a national resource. You don't pay for the licence, but rather you undertake a work programme where that data goes to the nation. And then in any future success case, like the North Sea, the southern North Sea, the revenue, 50% of it finds its way back to Treasury through taxation revenue. But this first phase is about science, about understanding that geology and understanding whether or not UK shale in Yorkshire, in the East Midlands, in Chester area has the potential, shares the same attributes as those successful United States shales.
Yeah. And perhaps then moving on to a second question from Les Williams dealing with the scale of commercial viability. Is Les Williams here?
Yeah, I'm here, but you can read, I'm fine with that.
Okay, right. Is fracking commercially viable without a large number of wells being drilled and the added infrastructure to support those wells?
So the answer to that is dependent on this phase of science, what you understand to be present. So often I'm asked that question, but that question is asked in isolation of looking at the United States. When you look at the different states in the US, you have to look at the geology. What is it producing? Is it just methane? Is it just, or is it methane plus wet gas, ethane and other components? Or indeed, is it a shale oil play? All of those different components have different component values and find themselves in different geological settings and have therefore different ways in which they play out at surface. So we, given the existing petroleum information that exists in the UK in these areas, you would expect that because there's a working petroleum system in this geology, you would expect that you would see methane and possibly ethane, propane, other elements within that. And so the comparison that we draw is on when we look at US plays of a similar constituent. And our view is that, yes, it is subject to taking core samples and understanding volumes and flow rates from these wells, that there is such a prize, a potential there, that it is worth this early exploration expenditure. That's why we've sought to bid and to undertake this early science and exploration and appraisal.
Yes. Maybe, Chris, you could assist on this point from a planning point of view in looking at the conservation status of the areas of outstanding natural beauty and the national parks around here. Are there any issues from that perspective when one looks at the scale of drilling? And perhaps you could help there.
Yes, absolutely. And both Tom and Rob hinted heavily there about the role that planning has. I mean, clearly when you're drilling for minerals, the mineral can only be extracted where it exists, so the geology is extremely important. But each decision on whether a well is drilled or not is down to a planning decision. Clearly there are a lot of other regulatory bodies involved, and I'm sure we'll go on to that later. But I just want to stress the importance of decisions on whether shale gas goes ahead in each area is down to the Minerals Planning Authority and their policy. The plan that I mentioned earlier is being worked up, and there is a draft policy in there. The plan has to go through an examination in public next year, and those policies have got to be agreed by a planning inspector before the plan's adopted. But there's certainly a draft policy in there that talks about the cumulative impact of wells, and the draft policy is indicating that there could be up to 10 wells per 100 kilometres. That's a pedal licence area, and certainly anything over that density is not likely to receive support. Now, I want to just make it clear that that doesn't mean to say that you're going to get 10 wells per 100 square kilometres, because there are a lot of other constraints. And again, both previous speakers hinted at what those constraints are. This area of the country is incredibly well endowed with very, very high environmental designations. We have 2 national parks. We have 2 areas of outstanding natural beauty. There's the city of York, which has got protection in terms of its historic setting and green belt. We've got a lot of very important water source protection zones, and then there's a host of other designations such as ancient monuments, sites of special scientific interest, and then a raft of other internationally important European designations. So this area, although it's well endowed with shale gas, is also very, very heavily constrained, and some of those areas are so important. They're actually no-go areas as far as fracking is concerned, and that's not just our local policies, but that's also embodied in national legislation. So at the end of the day, you might find it quite hard to find somewhere to put a well, but I just want to stress there is a lot of constraint in this area.
Can I I come back on a
Yes,
couple
Rob,
of
yes,
points?
certainly.
On the first point, coming back to the issue of scale, just to put it in context, this is a particular shale that we're dealing with here. If you look at North America, they have hundreds of different types of shale basins, and only 1 in 10 of those is actually commercial. So what I'm saying here is that when you're looking at this basin, there is a 90% chance that when they drill their exploration wells, that maybe it's not going to be commercial. So let's say it is. How do you determine whether it's commercial or not? In the US, it takes on average 100 wells to get to the point where you know that your basin is commercial. So that wouldn't say 100 wells here, but across the shale, you'd need that number of wells potentially to determine whether you've got a commercial shale. And it's only at that point that you would then make that decision to really go full scale. And make no mistake, this is a manufacturing business. This is not your traditional oil or gas business. This is a manufacturing business which relies on well after well after well. So this becomes a manufacturing business, in which case you need the scale to lower your overall cost per well, and therefore you need a whole set of logistics and all the rest of it in there. So scale is very important in here, but the scale won't come for another 10, 15 years. The second point I have, just on the licences over I can't understand why you'd have licences over national parks where INEOS is paying licence fees if it already knows that it won't be able to drill on those licences. It just seems counterintuitive that the government would issue licences on national parks. So my question then would be, probably back to the MP, why is the government putting out licences in areas where it won't legislate drilling, or has it got at some point in the future its mind to change its mind and allow that drilling to occur?
So I think Kevin wanted to speak anyway,
Yes,
so over to you, Kevin.
I would. I think both the questions from Ian and Les are absolutely so relevant questions, because I think there's a feeling probably in the audience as well, this may be a national opportunity, and I believe it is, but are the producers going to be left in charge with this resource, and are they going to change the very nature of the countryside? And I absolutely believe that should not be the case. This must be regulated properly, and it must be planned properly, and have the proper controls locally and nationally to make sure we do preserve our local landscapes and our countryside. And I absolutely believe that's what will happen. That's why I went out to Pennsylvania in there, where you saw there. You saw low visual impact where fracking sites had happened, and a frack site is a very low visual impact. But you also saw where the planning regime in the US is not anywhere near as tight as it is in the UK. It's not as democratic as it is in the UK. And people like Chris will make sure that we do make sure this stays a low visual impact. That's why we've got a draft policy at North Yorkshire County Council of 10 sites per 100 square kilometres. So that is a relatively small impact when it's been fracked. If you want to see an example of what a fracked site will look like, go to Kirby Misperton. That's a conventional well pad, but that will look exactly like a site that has been fracked. There's no drilling rigs towering over a site that's been fracked. Those drilling rigs are there for about a year, then they go, and there's no significant infrastructure left on that site. So yes, I think this can be done in a way that's respectful of the countryside and doesn't change the very nature of the countryside, but we do need the checks and balances in place. In terms of the National Park and AONB, this is something I absolutely have pressed the ministers on and the Prime Minister on, successive Prime Ministers on, and I have got in writing that there will be no surface drilling in national parks and AONB, or indeed there should be protections of buffer zones around to protect the visual impact of those, and I will absolutely fight tooth and nail to make sure that never happens.
Thank you. Yes, well, if you'd like to...
I can add just there, when the licensing round was conducted, what Kevin talks about achieving in terms of the not being allowed to drill in National Park hadn't been achieved. It was during the licensing round that was achieved. So what was actually submitted for, that now the element that is National Park, although the licence ordnance survey block covers the area, it is removed from the ability to have a site.
Yes, so I suppose Rob's point is that maybe rather like the Bake Off, INEOS have bought a tent, but no one to go in it. Yes, so we'll come on to some more planning matters shortly, Lindsay.
I just joined that one up.
No, I'll come on to you in a minute, okay. Whereas Rob is saying, you know, we perhaps look to the future and, you know, would they have bought this had there not been a bigger plan? Kevin gives us assurances that there will be no surface drilling. So I'd like to move on to the next question, please, which is the handling of gas from wells. And this is a question from Christopher Pickles. When you drill an exploratory well, how do you intend to deal with the gas until you have a pipeline in place? And also, I'd like to add into this, perhaps, because it ties into some other questions, how do you ensure there's no leakage from that drilling before you've got all your protections in place?
So when you're drilling, we have a wellhead on top of that borehole and then a closed loop system. In terms of solutions to handle gas during our test phase, there are a number there. One is flaring, so a concealed flare for the period that you are undertaking that operation. There are other solutions such as a small temporary electrical generation unit that you burn the gas and make electricity for that period of time for the test. Those are some examples of what you might do. You would also have on a site, in case either of those, a safety mechanism to have a vent stack on place on a site, but that vent stack, like any facility that uses those, is for limited emergency response usage. And so I guess 84% of homes in the UK receive gas through pipelines safely into homes every day, and that probably gives some sense of the regulatory backdrop on infrastructure.
Okay. Rob, is there anything you want to add from a technical point of view?
Well, there's no such thing as a concealed flare. You can try and conceal it as much as you want, but you'll see it for several miles away.
Okay, so Tom, is it the case that the flares are visible for some distance? What's meant by a concealed flare?
I'd extend the invitation through consultation in Scotland in a project I was involved in previously. One of the concerns was light from flare. We designed and built a flare with ceramic rings that hide the burn. Of course, if you were looking down on it on the day that it's lit, it's possible to see the burning, of course, the glow from the burn. But actually, in terms of visual impact, in conversation with that village, it's possible to do it. I'd be pleased to take Rob to look at that piece of equipment.
Yes. So for how long does the concealed flare run for during the process of drilling?
The flare wouldn't be used during drilling. You do have an emergency line for flaring during drilling, but typically that's for emergency uses only. A flare is used once the drilling rig has gone and you're trying to test the flow rate from that well to see whether or not you're achieving commercial volumes to surface. It's during that phase of flowing gas to surface and testing how the rocks perform that a flare is used to handle that gas.
And over what period of time does that run during the...
You would expect, it depends on the particular geology. In conventional wells it can be a week. Because shale is tighter, typically those well test periods are anything between 1 and 3 months. And I would say now that you would expect in the early stages of looking at UK shale, because the science over these next few phases, it would be a 3-month commitment that I would seek to ask for in planning, because that gives me the best data on which to make and provide judgment.
Thank you. Okay. in our particular area, what is the likely chemical balance to be used in the process of fracking? I know there are many, many different chemicals which are used. Are there any that are of particular toxicity or ones which cause people concern? I know the carcinogenic based chemicals which have been used in America.
That's a very wide-ranging question,
Yes.
but I'll try and break it into pieces for you. So, firstly, the many that you describe, Helen, that what you use to stimulate gas production from the natural fractures in the shale, that frac and the chemicals used are designed when you've taken the core data in these early vertical cored wells. So the mineralogy, the pressures, the temperatures, the depths, and the type of sand that you use are all driven by the data that you gather during that phase. The media would have you believe, and I guess, that you would use 300 plus chemicals in every frac job, and the reality is that is not the case. Typically, if you look at the US, if you go to look at those operators in the US that have chosen to be transparent, where in the regulatory backdrop there they're not required necessarily to, but some have, in order to try and address some of the concerns about lack of transparency. But they are using typically between 6 and 12 chemicals to undertake that frac. The frac chemicals are used for a number of purposes. One is to viscosify the fluid, to carry sand in suspension down to the reservoir. Another is to provide stimulation of whatever the mineralogy is in that rock. So, for example, if it's calcite healed, then a weak acid dissolves that calcite and improves the fracture network to the wellbore. And equally, there are biocides used to clean and remove bacteria before the frac is pumped from the water that you gain at surface. And probably the last one of any note is the corrosion inhibitor that you use as part of protecting the lining of steel within that wellbore.
Yes,
the only thing I would I think there are a number of. I mean, there's been a lot of research on the chemicals, and I think it's a fair point that what you put down the hole is safe. I think. I mean, there's been the real explanation of why you need to do it is that when you drill your hole and you get to the point of intersecting with the horizon, which has got what you think is the gas in it or the oil in it, you pressure it up to a point where you have to, it basically hydraulically fractures. It fractures the rock, and then you need at that point to have the sand or the chemicals go into the rock, and the sand itself then keeps the fractures open, and that then allows the gas to escape through it and back up the wellbore. So that's why you need to have these chemicals go, and why you particularly need to have the sand to go into the rock. So this is the whole point of hydraulic fracturing is the fracturing of the rock to make the cracks to enable the gas to come out, and that is, leads on to the other topic about, what is the impact of that, and will that cause earthquakes or won't it cause earthquakes and all the rest of it. But I mean, my sense on the fracking and what's been put down wells and reading the literature on that is it's a proven technology, and it's a technology that's been used in the industry. It's been more defined in the last, say, 5-10 years. It's been used in the industry probably for about 20 or 30 years, but as the time has moved on, we've actually refined it to a much more certain science. So I feel fairly happy with what's being done downhole, and I also feel fairly happy with what's been with the issue about earthquakes and triggering of earthquakes. Well, did you know that there was a major earthquake in the UK on the 27th of October? I bet none of you felt it. It was a number 3 seismic quake, and it occurred just offshore Sunderland. But that was far higher than anything you'd find in a frac well.
I don't know, Joe, whether there's anything you can add in terms of the regulatory framework for the chemical composition of the fracking materials.
Yeah, so I suppose the key thing to note is that comparisons to Australia and the US are not particularly helpful. The reasons being that the regulations in those jurisdictions are very different. So, you know, for example, in the US, they have been using chemicals that have been problematic. In the UK, all the chemicals that will be used have to be disclosed to the Environment Agency, and they must be classed as non-hazardous. So it means that those chemicals that have been problematic in other jurisdictions wouldn't be allowed in the UK. And the Environment Agency will have a full list of all those chemicals and chemical assessments as to how they interact and what they are doing.
Yes. So what is meant by non-hazardous within the environmental framework?
So we have a number of different labels. So we have things that class as non-pollutants, and things that class as non-hazardous. So your hazardous tends to be chemicals that are toxic or that are likely to cause harm to human health. So it's those types of chemicals that there has been a lot of concern about in the US that wouldn't be permitted here under the permitting scheme we have.
Okay, thank you. Then the next question is one from James Robinson, dealing with water contamination, perhaps leading on from what we've just heard. But again, a question for you, Tom, I think, to start off with. Can you prove that the chemical contaminants from fracking will not enter spring water, which rises up from deep aquifers under pressure?
So I think to take the issues of water contamination is much more complex. Whenever the word fracking is used, fracking is one small component. It's rather like describing the entire process as driving, the entire process of road safety, car design, fuel containment, driver training as driving. So there are a number of areas where the risk of pollution can occur, and I would describe three of them. The first is in your wellbore construction, the drilling and the pumping of that frack, ensuring integrity as you pass down through those different layers of aquifer. The second is through containment on that site, that surface. So if I pick the civil engineering design, the bunds, contained tanks, double skin tanks, all of how you build and membrane that site is crucial. And if you look to the evidence in the US, then it is where they've simply graded a site, no membrane, they've dug open pits, such that the regulation allows this, and there has been leaching. Those practices are simply not allowed under UK regulation. So when you look back over the 15 years, you can see very clearly examples there. The third area of risk is the transportation in and out of that, of either what you're bringing to the site or what you're evacuating from the site for treatment, and ensuring the conduct of the supply chain does that. Now, we do that in our chemicals plants in the UK, our refineries, on a regular basis. To finish off, one of the areas in the US when you go to speak with operators in Pennsylvania, for example, that they openly admit, you can go and look at the Centre for Sustainable Shale, but they didn't take the kind of baselines from the start that are now required within the UK regulatory backdrop. So we have to take those before, during and after measurements, so that we can demonstrate that actually from the three categories I've described to you, you have got that containment. And it is a feature of the wellbore design, the regulations that go around wellbore design and construction in the UK, that we're required to test the integrity of that wellbore as we drill, which again is not necessarily the case in some of the states within the US.
Yes. Rob, do you have any information in relation to the integrity of drilling structures that might assist us to assess whether or not any chemical contamination of water courses would occur?
Well, I think, I was ahead of this meeting, I was looking for cases where there were definitive pollution of aquifers in North America, given how many wells have been drilled. And I find it very hard to find any real proven cases I think, you know, if any of you obviously have seen the film Gaslands and people opening their taps up and methane coming out, what you'll probably find is actually that's something that's occurred in those towns for years before. There's a river in Australia which is bubbling gas at the moment, has been fracking there recently, but actually the Aborigines, when first landed, first described this as a flaming stream. So a lot of the hype about pollutants and the fracking causing aquifers to be polluted I don't know. It's hard to prove a proven case, and even in those cases where you say, well, actually, in the literature there are descriptions of aquifers being polluted. It's very hard to link that back into fracking. In fact, probably some of those cases were linked back into oil wells which were drilled through the shale many years earlier, and there'd been some pollution from that. But I don't think anybody can definitively say it will never happen.
Yes, Kevin, you want to add something?
Well, just to follow up on the point, I mean, it's a very interesting question, James, and a question I've been asked quite a number of times. I think in the US, as Tom alluded to earlier, there's no requirement to do baseline monitoring. So the quality of water today, the quality of the air quality, seismic activity, in the UK there is. So they've got independent monitoring going on now around the sites that at Kirby Misperton, for example, by the British Geological Survey. You can see the monitoring equipment there. So they're measuring this now, and obviously they'll measure the impacts through the drilling process and afterwards to make sure there aren't the impacts people are worried about. But there's been 3 significant studies in the US by Yale University, by the University of Cincinnati and Texas University, all who have concluded there is no fracking fluid appearing back into the aquifers from this process. The Environmental Protection Agency also said there's no systemic migration of fracking fluids into aquifers. So as long as this process is regulated properly, and clearly bad practice can happen, we've got to make sure it isn't. But I think the fact you're getting the baseline monitoring done independently should give people reassurance that this can be done safely.
But I think the question that might flow from the audience relating to that is, once your monitoring is in place, when it reveals, as some people fear, contamination, what then? We've monitored it, we've found it's happened. How do we prevent that? So I can see Jo nodding her head, wanting to get in there, so perhaps you can help us there.
So there's 2 aspects to it. So before the Infrastructure Act came in, there weren't these monitoring of baseline requirements, and that was a really big concern, because if you want to attribute liability for any damage, you have to attribute fault. Now, if you don't have any baseline data, it's very difficult to show that somebody has actually caused damage. So, you know, that change is very welcome. One of the issues potentially at the exploration stage, however, is that under the Infrastructure Act, hydraulic fracturing has a very specific definition, which depends on the quantity of water that is going to be used either at each stage or across the entire process. Now, if the water doesn't reach that volume, it's not going to fall under the classification of hydraulic fracturing for the purposes of the Infrastructure Act, which means that you won't necessarily have that baseline monitoring, which is potentially problematic. So overall, it is good that we have this requirement, because it will help if there are any issues, and we do think that there might be liability. You are going to have that baseline data to refer back to. But there is still a concern that at the exploration stage, not all sites will necessarily have that baseline data.
Do you have any information, perhaps Lindsay, in relation to the baseline data point? Are the council satisfied that these baseline data is being achieved in this area?
I can't exactly answer. As I said, I'm not in that realm, but all I can tell you is about obviously what goes on and conditions that are put on particular applications. And it was all very new about 3 years ago, and government officials came up to Rydale and gave us a talk about this. And one of my questions to him was, what happens with wells if something happens, if something goes wrong and no one will admit responsibility? And he said, well, we can't really give you any information on that because we've got no background data. But also, what was said was that, well, companies move on and can, you know, resell their sites on. So it would be very, very difficult to go back to the main person because probably they've been gone. So it's very, very difficult to say that that is in place. But I would just like to say, if I could, because obviously the first opportunity I've come to talk is that to listen to Kevin, fracking is coming whether we like it or not. And going back to the planning at Kirby Misperton, you say, and quite rightly, that we are in an area where there will be many constraints and we won't be able to frack in certain areas. So what does that leave? That leaves places like Kirby Misperton to be fracked in, and beautiful areas probably where, you know, some of you guys live, that we're just regular people, and we are going to have fracking brought upon us because we can't go to York, as you've said, we can't go to the national parks. So that is where fracking is going to be. But there is just one thing that I wanted to say to you about recently the planning permission given by North York County Council to Kirby Misperton, and I see that the planning chair is with us this evening. The committee put on a lot of conditions regarding heavy vehicles going over our listed bridges. And the first thing I said to the police is, I'm pleased to know that you're going to regulate the lorries. And the police said, that's nothing to do with us. We'll
come back to transport and that area later. I'm wanting to look at the water contamination point at the moment. So, Chris, I wonder if you could deal with, and I'll come back to you specifically, Lindsay, on the local implications when we get to that section. But looking at the water contamination, is there anything from the national parks area and planning areas which can assist us assess whether the regulatory framework is going to work and be effective?
Yes, I just wanted to come quickly back to a point that Joe raised in terms of loopholes in the Infrastructure Act and when fracking isn't fracking and whether or not it's using a certain pressure or is it dependent upon the amount of fluid being used, and then there's this term associated fracking. When we were drawing up the plan, we were pretty concerned about this because things could then creep under the radar. So what we've done in this plan is to treat the fracturing of the geology as fracking, irrespective of the pressure used or the fluid used. So, exploratory fracking that's not using the amount of fluid that would meet the Infrastructure Act requirements would still get caught by our policies, and those policies would then attach baseline monitoring conditions to it. So we've sealed that loophole there. Another point that Lindsay raised was if the operator then moves on. Well, of course, planning conditions will adhere to these sites for the requirement to monitor well after the production has ceased. And those planning conditions run with the land, not the operator. So anybody coming in after that are still subject to those conditions. So again, that deals with that point. But in terms of water contamination, I would agree that unlike a lot of other development in this country, and we've seen over the last 10 years successive governments deregulating planning to the extent where I feel the planning system is much weaker than it was 10 years ago. It's not only Kevin's government, it started under Gordon Brown actually. In contrast to that, this area of development is incredibly well regulated. There are 4 different regulatory bodies. So you've got your Minerals Planning Authority that needs to give it planning permission. You've got the Oil and Gas Regulatory Body, which is part of what used to be DEC, that finally gives consent for drilling and gives the licences in the first place. You've got the Health and Safety Executive, who look at the design of the operations and the safety of the drill and the rig to make sure that there's no leakages. And then you've got the Environment Agency as well that has to give environmental licences. And it's really that body, the Environment Agency, that has the responsibility for looking after groundwater and surface water contamination. So I would say that this is pretty well regulated part of development.
But I think, Colin, something that Joe's pointed up and something we perhaps know from other chemical spillages into waterways, the Environment Agency has notional powers but seems to be incapable of preventing pollution when there is an error somewhere along the system. Are you satisfied that the way in which the legislation has been drafted does give adequate protection?
Is that for me? Did you call me Colin then?
I did.
You did, yeah.
I did this all through one meeting and I knew I'd do it again tonight. So, Kevin.
Well, as Chris alluded to earlier, there are a number of different regulators that oversee shale gas exploration. Personally, I'd like to see one lead regulator rather than this kind of raft of regulators. The Environment Agency have been given extra money by government to be able to oversee fracking to make sure that it is done properly. I think in terms of Lindsay's earlier point is that if pollution happens and the producer's gone bust or sold its licence on, but certainly a following producer would also have responsibility to remediate any problems. There's what we've been promised by the industry that INEOS is part of, an organisation called UCOG, is an industry fund in case an operator went out of business at some point in time, which we absolutely need to see the detail of, so to make sure that the landowner doesn't pick up the tab. But it's certainly my belief, having the independent monitoring, which I've certainly lobbied for, and many others have too, which we've got in place, and the Environment Agency, which we've had them before our all-party group on shale gas exploration, regulation and planning in Parliament, to make sure they've got the capacity to properly regulate. I think it's a fair question. At this stage, the industry is in its infancy. We haven't done a frack since 2011. I'm sure we can supervise this well adequately, the first one, if it happens in Kirby Misperton, and the data that comes from that should, I believe, give people reassurance that this can be done in a way that doesn't damage the environment.
Have you got anything to add to come back on, Joe?
So the only thing I would say is when we talk about the Environment Agency regulating this, is to understand that, so this is normal in all industrial processes, the Environment Agency isn't on site. So what will happen is they'll grant a permit to your operator to conduct certain activities. And within that permit, they'll have a set of objectives. So the operator must then explain to the Environment Agency how they're going to meet those objectives. And they will then send off weekly reports of the data and also be subject to spot checks when and where the Environment Agency can do it. So, but I just think it's important when we talk about this agency overview that there is this understanding, and it's used throughout different industries, that there is a lot of self-reporting and internal management of objectives rather than a real external force.
Right. Perhaps I could ask Tom in terms, because I've not heard of UCOG, the fund, before. Is this something you could explain to the audience, please, and whether it's a sum of money that INEOS have contributed to?
So as Kevin says, there's this early phase of science, but there has been a lot of conversation about how do you deal with this. The licence itself does place currently the in perpetuity the responsibility, but as councillor next to me has said, what if a company isn't around? So that is one of the aspects that's being addressed. So the plan, the other area, the secondary element of that is that there's the potential for an industry insurance product that the companies commit to, that allows for clean-up in event of an environmental piece. And then there was the long-term bond from the industry, and what has been discussed, and it isn't finalised yet, but it is how do you address that for the long term, much like you have funds that are bonded from coal mining days that the Coal Authority administers and remediates from. So that's the type of concept, but I'll be clear that the actual construct of that bond is, as Kevin says, it's not fully determined yet because they're trying to agree how that would be done.
Yes, perhaps the council can help us here, or the national parks. Lindsay first. Is it something that the council, when looking at planning issues, can impose as a condition that a clean-up fund is put in place?
Well, I think it's already just been answered that there isn't actually anything in place, and that's exactly that's what was asked. No, you said it's not quite in place yet, is it? But
let's not have an argument. Lindsay, can you deal with it from the audience's perspective?
Yes.
Is it something that the council could continue to press for?
Well, I would honestly hope that the North York County Council would press for. I mean, that's all I can say. But if things aren't actually in place, then it's difficult to monitor.
Yeah, and perhaps from the National Parks point of view, is it something the National Parks can press for?
Well, it's something that's common practice. I mean, we have given permission for conventional gas extraction and exploration in the national park, and a planning condition requiring either an insurance bond or an escrow account in the event of a pollution incident or the company going bust is a standard planning condition that we always put on.
Yeah. Kevin, what steps can, from a government point of view, can you take to set this up sooner rather than later? Because what if there is an incident and there's no funds, the industry have no obligation to come forward to remedy the situation.
No, I think it's absolutely right. If this does roll out to any extent, that we have this fund in place, and we've said this on a number of occasions to energy ministers, and we'll continue to do that. Obviously, at this point in time, should the operator at Kirby Misperton do a problem, Third Energy would have to resolve that problem. But as I say, if this scales up, then we absolutely need to see the detail behind that scheme. The application at Kirby Misperton is for a test frac, so it's a very small scale application to see if there is this gas down there and it will come out. So there's no point in getting too far ahead of ourselves to say this is a fully fledged industry, but if the opportunity is there and it's likely to roll out, we absolutely definitely need to see these things in place.
Yes, and from INEOS's point of view, I take it that INEOS would be happy to subscribe to such a scheme.
Yes, we have done. I just echo that point. In the immediate term where companies undertaking this work are here, they're guided by the same principles. They are able to take care of their operations, and we would, of course, do that. This is about if it was successful and it was rolled out longer term. Yes, we understand the reason for that, and we're supporting those talks through UCOG to arrive at something that gives that confidence in the case that this is successful and there are multiple sites and multiple operators across the UK.
Right. Okay, so well, we've taken an hour on that first section, so I think maybe there's some duplication in some of the questions which follow on from points which have been made in this section. So if you've submitted a question that I think leads to the same areas being covered, perhaps I'll skip that question if you'll forgive me.